Of this 3 days conference, and I think it is now time to make a final analysis of everything that has been said during all our panels in the last 3 days, and give also a bit of an outlook to the future. And therefore we have put together this result and recommendation sessions where all the moderators of our sessions in these 3 days will report on the results, on the main things that was said during the panels, and give a bit of an outlook also on the future. And this results and recommendation session will again be moderated by Dr. Driss El Hadani. And I'd like to ask you to give him a round of applause for his moderation. Please.
Thank you, Christian. As you said, we are coming to the final session, which is the presentation of the results and the recommendations. And please join me to welcome this panel and the moderators of the 6 sessions. First one is Jean-Pascal Lefranc from CNES, Van Monsami from SANSA, South Africa, Space Agency, Christian Armstrong from Petra Strategy, Rania Turkirbi from Space Generation Advisory Council, Crystal Wilson from the Secure World Foundation, Iman Khantouti from the Moroccan section of the SCAG, and Camille Byrne from HEED Aerospace Group, and finally but not least, David Kandal from Canada. First of all, I would like to thank all these moderators for the effort they have deployed to make decisions fruitful and the debate very interesting. And I will give the floor, as I in the same order, to the moderators to present the conclusions and the recommendation of a session. First of all, Jean-Pascal, please.
Thank you, Driss, and good afternoon to everybody. So thank you. The GLEC 2019 first session touched upon the benefits of space technology and applications to socio-economic development. The morning panel focused on the space agency's perspective, featuring prominent head of agencies from both the emerging countries and the established space countries. The keynote speech of Driss El Hadani, my neighbor, and also the director of the Centre Royal de Télédétection Spatiale, highlighted the main tendencies of the space sector today, be it in terms of opportunities or challenges, and concluded with some remarks on the main important subjects to be tackled by emerging nations willing to invest in space to foster their socio-economic development, namely resources, capacities, and governance. During the panel, the heads of agencies illustrated these different topics with a lot of vivid examples, which can also be considered as recommendations for the future. And of course, this is absolutely impossible to summarize the richness of the panel, so I just picked up a few examples, and of course, this is only a small part of it. So the first example is giving hope to the youth by investing in inspiring missions to Mars, for instance, in the case of the United Arab Emirates, who call their mission HOPE, precisely, and encourage the young generation in embracing a career in STEM, or in STEAM, as General Bolden said a few hours later. Another example, taking advantage in multidisciplinary approaches, as does the DLR in its cooperation with Morocco, mixing energy and space research. providing a full range of products and services, taking the full benefit of a comprehensive space program in all fields, including human spaceflight, as in the case of Russia, promoting active international cooperation amongst space actors on different horizons in a win-win approach to share the benefits of space, as does France in its very active international cooperation strategy. Focus on the applications of satellite data and on the economic return of space investment, as does the British government, on a domestic and also international environment, of course. Engaging a dialogue with the government to make sure that the agency policy is in line with what the government really wants, and in the case of South Africa, the focus is clearly on environment, health, and economic development. Make sure that national prestige considerations do not divert the national investment, which should, in the contrary, present a high value for money, as in the case of Azeri's space projects. Prepare and encourage the young generation to take over from the many space engineers and scientists that will retire in the years to come, an important recommendation. And finally, make sure to maximize the benefits of cooperation, be it regional, international, interagencies, or with the industry to increase the efficiency of the national policies. So in conclusion, throughout the conversation within the panel, it became clear that in these days of profound changes, from technological innovation to global challenges in front of us, or with the emergence of new actors, more than 100 countries are engaged now in space activities, as Dries said in his introduction. Space technologies, products, applications, and services are becoming more and more relevant for the socio-economic development of all countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Pascal. It's a little bit hard mission to synthesize the recommendation and the results of the sessions, as the debate was very interesting and very rich. And I think that this contribution is very important, and we surely will try to make a global synthesis of all this. The second part of this first session on the benefits of space for development, socio-economic development, was moderated by Val, and I'm giving him the floor.
Okay, I've got a few slides, and thank you, Dries. We wait for that to come up. Oh, click. So I'm going to present on the second part of plenary one, but looking at it from an industry perspective. And so you'll recall that the session was dedicated to the hare and the tortoise. But there are three very burning questions coming from emerging countries. It's the role of industry in the emerging countries and how you structure the public-private partnerships. The second is how to bridge the gap using space science and technology with regards to the fourth industrial revolution and the sustainable development goals. And then how do you ensure effective localization of space technology and applications within the emerging countries? And the first presentation was a keynote address by General Bolden. And in his address, he indicated that at the time when he took office as administrator of NASA, there was at least 380 agreements signed at that time. So international partnerships and partnership with the local industry was becoming quite significant. And during his tenure, he fostered the development of a commercial space industry. And it was driven by three main drivers. The first was to provide services for the International Space Station. The second was to transport astronauts to the ISS. And the third was to use that platform for international collaboration and using the industry as a vehicle. And then NASA used the public-private partnership as a vehicle to bridge the gap between NASA itself and the private sector. And during his tenure, he also pushed for space exploration, and specifically the push towards Mars. And his rationale for doing that was that the technological advances coming from such a mission could be used to improve the quality of life here on Earth. And then there was 8 panel of experts that each kind of gave us a 5-minute rundown in terms of the respective responses to the questions. And then Kyle presented on his perspective around the fact that emerging countries should actually be involved in space exploration despite the limited budgets. And the rationale for doing that is that being involved in such initiatives actually helps in achieving the SDGs. And he gave the example of, would you rather mine the ocean or mine the moon? And I think that's debatable. And then the space exploration could also be the economy of the future, looking at specifically space resources. And he also provided the example of Luxembourg, looking at diversification of the economy, given the steel industry crashing. And that was based on the appreciation for the demand of space resources within the next 30 years. And so they've invested about 5% of the GDP towards the space sector. And they've already seen significant rates of returns, specifically on the telecoms industry. And then Bruce Chesley from the US indicated that aeronautics is a precursor to astronautics, and that Boeing has entered into a partnership with Morocco 2.5 years ago. And the whole idea behind that was to accelerate the development of the local aeronautics sector here in Morocco, and to eventually create 8,700 new jobs, and to have an industry of a 1 billion rand per annum turnover by 2028. And that this partnership is also structured around technology transfer and training from Boeing to Morocco. And he also touched briefly on the role of non-governmental organizations, and specifically referred to the Education for Employment initiative in Morocco. And then Luigi from PricewaterhouseCoopers spoke around the work they do around assessments of the economic impact of the investments in the space sector. And I think to date they've done over 30 socioeconomic benefits assessments for various countries and institutions. And they also focus on how do you optimize your investments to see a greater rates of return. And some of these studies have actually helped motivate for greater investments in the space sector. And he also raised a key issue at the end, which I hope did not go missing to the audience, was the challenges faced by fragile states where governance is poor. But some of these assessments could actually help to address some of the challenges in those countries. And John from Thales Alenia Space, well, in response to the fact that we observed that there were no woman representation, said that Thales Alenia has 40% women as part of the workforce. He focused on the telecommunications aspect, specifically towards emerging countries, and gave the example of Bangladesh, where they invested in e-education, and the multiplier effect was over 50 in terms of the investments that were put in. And then he also indicated how e-business could be facilitated through telecommunications, especially if you're living in a small town or rural area. You could still participate in the global value chain with telecommunications. And he also gave the example of a satellite being built for Morocco that focuses on agriculture and fisheries, and that in some areas the crop yield has increased by a factor of 2. And then Oliver from Airbus stressed the importance of telecommunications as well, and the use of public funds to invest in critical space infrastructure. Now, telecommunications is very critical because it also defines your knowledge economy, especially where many countries are trying to play. And it also allows for penetration in remote areas, and again, allows for businesses to be established in very rural areas as well. And then he touched on Earth observation and navigation being other areas apart from telecommunications, and indicated that EGNOS in Africa is an opportunity for Africa with regards to navigation and timing applications in the region. And so to effectively respond to some of these initiatives, it's very important for government to focus on enabling the local ecosystems to respond to these opportunities. And then Stuart Martin from the Satellite Applications Catapult, he indicated that his view was that emerging countries should focus on the downstream applications, not just on the technology platforms necessarily. He also indicated that the SDGs itself was a call to arms to the space sector. I think if you look around the literature, at least 50 to 60% of the SDGs are informed by satellite platforms. But he also cautioned that when we're looking at sustainability, it's not just around the environment, but also looking at it from economic sustainability point of view. And that developing countries need to play a more meaningful role with regards to the SDGs. And that developed countries actually need developing countries and not the other way around necessarily. And that's because if you look at inside of developed countries and the institutions that are represented, because of the legacy issues in terms of the systems and the architecture, it's much more difficult for them to change track technology that comes in. But it's much easier for new adopters like emerging countries to adopt those technologies and see how far they can run with it. And that can help these big companies that come up with new technologies and solutions. And then C.S. Mostert from South Africa Space Commercial Services indicated the experience in South Africa and how human capital and expertise was developed for the defense sector, but later used at the university level to build South Africa's first satellite called Sunset. And from that initiative, there were components sold to South Korea and Australia, and that led to the subsequent development of some Sat. And he expressed frustration with regards to fostering alliances in Africa, and his hope was that the establishment of the African Space Agency will foster multilateral cooperation. And then Vitaly Stefanov from GLEC Cosmos, his focus was on the fact that emerging countries should look at socioeconomic development and the applications perspective and consider how space technologies could support those initiatives, those challenges on the ground. He indicated from a GLEC Cosmos point of view that their launch capabilities that they've developed in-house is actually based on the Soyuz platform, which is currently the most reliable access to space. And he also indicated how the launch of Yuri Gagarin into orbit inspired many children in the former Soviet Union. And that inspired them to take up science and technology as a career. And it's those very young individuals back then who are now working in the current Russian space industry. We then went to a question and answer session. And the responses that came from the various questions that I posed and that came from the floor as well was that emerging countries cannot focus on the full space ecosystem, the full value chain. You have to be strategic in your choices and look at what is the niche areas that affords you the optimum value creation. And that emerging countries should also think of clubbing together to share assets and focus on essential services. And in this manner, you could look at the diversity and the inclusion can be assured with respect to access to space among a number of countries, not just one or two countries. And that we should also be focusing on the downstream applications with better access to data. And that many lessons can be learned from the developed countries without reinventing the wheel necessarily. And these industries in the developed countries can act as proteges for new industries that are coming up in the developing countries. And then my last slide is that the question that was posed to Charles Bolden as to why NASA decided to set up or establish or foster a commercial space industry, that was triggered by the Space Shuttle Columbia accident. And they realized that the Space Shuttle program was quite risky, and they decided to exit the shuttle program. And that brought in the possibility of now going and developing the local space industry. And so that gave rise to the establishment of new space companies. And the emergence of small companies in emerging countries, the development of those companies should focus on very niche areas, which is consistent with the fact that you should not be playing across the entire ecosystem, and strive to work with bigger partners within the global space ecosystem. And that's for your tech transfer, your knowledge transfer, and so on. And the response from PricewaterhouseCoopers in terms of the assessments that they have done is not all socioeconomic benefits are necessarily quantifiable. and that specifically relates to the public goods benefits. And that countries should also consider using existing infrastructure and position these for future initiatives. And this was an example of the investments that was made behind the Iron Curtain in the early days and how that was used to support future initiatives. So that was in a nutshell the summary of the entire session. And I just want to remind us that this is just the start of the conversation of bridging the space divide and informing emerging countries as to the best approach to be taken on these different fronts. Thanks.
Thank you, Val, for this detailed report on the discussions and the proposals, questions that were discussed during this second part of the first panel. And one of the questions that was raised about financial resources, and this was the second, the team for the second session on financial models and resourcing. And Christian Armstrong is giving us an overview on the discussion during this second panel.
Good afternoon. I also want to take this opportunity to again thank the participants in the second session for offering their unique and valuable perspectives. I wanted to distill sort of the key message from each of the panelists, and these messages include, particularly from our keynote speaker, there are multiple financial models, and you know, there's not going to ever be one size fits all for every situation. And countries can adapt to new models over time, so the model that you might start with is not going to be the same model perhaps that you have 5 years later or 10 years later. And so going into it with an expectation that it's going to grow and evolve as needs change and priorities change. Another key point that was made is that, you know, space programs, they can be looked at as part of a larger portfolio of high-tech investments. Finding the connectivity between other portions of government programs or sectors of the economy is tremendously important for success in that area. Another point that was made was investing responsibly and sustainably to achieve the most benefit for the country. So really looking at the expectations of the benefits for making those kinds of investments in a space program. Another key point was that the government must have a sustained commitment and dedication to the goals. And so really having the commitment from the leadership is tremendously important. And then alignment with the financial resources with the national objectives. So there really has to be a synchronicity and a synergy for there to be success. And so what I distill from those points from each of the key speakers is that there's really the overarching themes of alignment. So alignment among the goals, the resources, the plans, all of those things need to have alignment for success. And then sustainability of the financial model has to support the sustainability and the longevity of the program for there to be the longer term view. And so what I would take away from the financial resources and model session is that tailoring the program and the finances to a country's needs and looking towards a long-term perspective so that it can endure. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian, for this report. And it's clear that the financing and resourcing is a very important and critical element. Next session in the program was the welcome ceremony, but no one was designated to report on this activity. So we will move to the next day, second day, with Rania, with his report on technology and skills development. Rania, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good afternoon. The third panel was actually about the technology and skills development. We had brilliant speakers, and we have discussed about the way to involve the developing countries in an effective way in the space field and to assure their long-term sustainability. So I assume that there is basically 4 pillars in order to make it. So I can say that the first one is basically the academia. We should first to emphasize the important role of the academia by educating, training, and helping the researchers to build their knowledge first, and then improve their capabilities, and supervising their work by the experts and space leaders. And of course, we should not forget the continuing education by process, since the space is a very dynamic field. The second point is that the space applications should be used for the education and involvement of the young engineers that are coming from different fields into the space. Because now we all know that we don't need only the space specialists, but we also need the other fields to interact together in order to build the space market. Also, we should encourage the local universities from the developing countries to participate in the international projects and events. The second big pillar is the government. So the government, it should play a big role in the establishment of the national program in a way to have space for the needs of the countries in terms of applications and use of data. And here we all talk about how to bring space down to earth. The second point was that the national plan should help the growth of the economy by facilitating the interactions between the entities. And here we mentioned the private-public partnerships. And it should work on the inspiration of the youth and the investors in order to work for the field. Then the government side still, so we have that the space should be used for the do. Here so we can mention that the international cooperation between the countries, like developing countries and the emerging, and the leading countries in space, as well as the new regulations and policies that should serve for space development in a very sustainable way. The third one are companies, that companies should start investing in a very big way in the space field, since we will need it all for our daily needs, and it should support the universities to train the resources and the skilled resources basically, and also define the regulations and rules. The fourth one that I esteem is really the most important one are the organizations and the agencies that should enhance the cooperation and share the know-how and show the successful models and of well-established business and cooperation. So we mention here that the UNOSA and space agencies, organizations have to support the emerging countries to follow, like offering fellowship programs to students first, then to governments, like they should help to facilitate the intergovernmental cooperation, and of course to the private entities in a way to encourage the investors to enlarge the space market. The most important sentence that attracted me was basically that we should focus now on the space awareness, like even before the space, the capacity building. This is basically our first priority, because now we should really start focusing on the countries that need really space for their needs, and that should be aware that is really the key now. Thank you.
Thank you, Rania. And we'll move to the next session, which was plenary 4 on the base infrastructure and requirements, and the report will be done by Crystal Wilson. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And yes, I'd like to again extend my thanks to both the speakers and to the audience for their wonderful participation on this topic. We had 2 goals. One was to identify the base infrastructure required for national space programs, and the second was to appreciate how to develop that. Interestingly enough, we didn't actually spend much time talking about building satellites or developing launch capabilities or ground stations, sort of the traditional view of what base infrastructure might mean. Instead, we had an incredibly diverse group of speakers, ranging from national space agencies to academia to industry, as well as several representatives focusing on specific initiatives that are being carried out right now. And despite this diversity, we actually had a couple of really important themes, I think, throughout a number of the comments. And essentially, the way I would see it is that a country or any entity who's asking this question really needs to step back and say, why are we doing this and what are we doing this, and really identify goals. And obviously that happens anytime someone creates a national space policy or goes through this process, but each speaker in their own way really emphasized the need to understand how space is going to bring benefit and to build up any requirements around base infrastructure around that. And that, again, that won't look the same wherever we go. So in some ways, one of our goals was a bit of a misnomer. There isn't one answer to this question for every country that's looking into this. There are going to be many, many different answers. If someone just tries to copy what another country has done, it won't work for them, because at the end of the day, space really has to be providing tangible benefits in order to be successful within various political environments. And so we heard a lot about how we might develop data infrastructures or build on what infrastructure is out there to leverage that capability within a country. And really, I would say we also looked at the challenges. And again, the challenges fall into the same category. It wasn't, oh, it's too expensive to build this or this. It was, a lot of costs have come down, but what you really have to do is identify what you need in a particular country, and then what are the best ways to go about getting that. In most cases, that's not going to be about becoming a launching state. That's not a requirement in order to receive the benefits of space. Instead, it might be how to tap into whatever data requirements or data needs are already out there, and to figure out how to operationalize that in your country. And so I thought that was a particularly interesting theme that came out of this. And while I can't claim to know what the organizers intended, I suspect this was not exactly what we were going to be focusing on. But I think it is actually really insightful, and we heard this again from a variety of different sources. And Colombia's answer was telecoms are important. For others, it's how can we support the SDGs. For others, it's going to be we really care about national prestige and security, and that's where we want to build our base infrastructure requirements around. And so we really have to avoid the mistake of thinking that there is one answer, or that base infrastructure really is exactly the same for everyone. Even if a country theoretically has similar needs, their particular government, their particular organization are going to answer those questions very differently.
Thank you, Crystal, for this report on the infrastructures. And now we will move to the workforce that will run these infrastructures. And I give the floor to Iman to report about the seminar of the Space Generation Council.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Haddani. I'm reporting about the next generation's view on space for emerging countries, which was the title of our seminar. Our seminar aimed to engage the youth of the emerging countries in discussion and give them the opportunity for policy input on space applications. Quoting Mr. Haddani, the youth is the future of every nation and the future inheritors of the Earth tomorrow. That's why that's the reason why we should enhance their contribution and implication following three key elements: research and development, entrepreneurship, and its impacts on the social as well as cultural and economic progress, and the fact that the government should support the young professionals and entrepreneurs. And three, of course, inspiring the young students by outreach programs. That's where the STEAM role comes to support the future of the emerging countries. According to Dr. Khatri, it is the basis for development of the ecosystem of space. It bridges the ethnic and gender gaps, sparks the interest in pursuing STEAM careers, and allows the competition in the global economy. It is indeed a great way to lateralize the brain to fuse the real-world problems. Getting there, the students and young professionals get more confidence and aim to higher education, feeding them into the industry. And now I'll come back to inspiration. Emerging countries should get inspired by the other countries to go further, get inspired by a program that wishes to inspire. This is what the space program of the UIA Space Agency aims to do. And Mr. Adnan Arais spoke about how the UIA is proceeding for sustaining the space program. According to him, focusing on and trusting the human element is very important. We should develop the technologies ourselves and focus on international collaborations. Then I'll move to our special guest, who was General Bolton. I was so honored to have a very invigorating discussion about how students and young professionals of the emerging countries can persist in their goals, in reshaping the space applications in the emerging countries and overcoming the difficulties, aiming towards international cooperations in the field. He emphasized that it is important to work on in diverse environments and try to create partnership and try and again, because failure is an absolute necessity. Then we had a few working groups where the delegates could work on 5 working groups. The first one was about regional collaboration on space applications. It had 10 participants from Germany, Morocco, US, India, Italy, and Canada. They have set the objectives of finding out drivers for building collaboration, define how effective collaboration looks like, and the outcomes was organizations such as IAF have to provide mechanisms that enable collaborations, such as travel support for the youth, build capacities of emerging countries to enable effective participations in collaboration, given the example of knowledge transferring and skills transferring, understanding what the various players can contribute in collaboration and what value each partner brings. Then the second working group was about IoT, Internet of Things, and space applications. It was it had 15 participants. It is the biggest number we could get in a working group, and then I heard it was a success. It had the group reached to 3 answers. A successful business model should, of course, identify the markets and partner financially, for example, with the government, and technically with academia and the administrations for real data on the field. Second, the IoT added values are the investment is small. It can benefit from the expertise of existing space agencies. It provides an opportunity for innovation. And then the third point was an application and future step consists of the applications of Earth observation in, for example, monitoring the territories or preventing catastrophes, for example. The working group 3 was legal and policy challenges of space applications with 5 participants. The objectives were to explain why space policy and law matters, and giving guidance on how to develop space policy and improve integrations of emerging countries in international space activities. The outcomes were a policy should offer a roadmap, and each country should know its strengths and weaknesses, and thus come up with potential space solutions. Space is a tool. It's not a goal. And then we had the technology development for socio-economic development, which was the 4th working group. And it has 8 participants with the objective of bringing space to Earth and identifying space users. And the outcomes were to apply astronomy and space sciences in agriculture, landscaping, desertification, and fire detection, which is a problem for many emerging countries and African countries. And the solutions was to have multi-year budgets and sustainable budgets for space projects and monopolizing the resources. Then the last working group was ways to engage the next generation from the emerging countries in the space applications. It had nine participants, and its objectives was to find underlying factors hindering the next generation in engagement from emerging countries, and to outcome with solutions to effectively engage the next generations. The outcome was recommendations for governments and stakeholders, So there should be a change in educational system policy, and there should be long-term investment in the area of space and its related technologies. The governments and stakeholders should invest in teachers by giving them the right training and make funding available and accessible for the youth. Give scholarships and training the youth of the rural areas because they are very good. They have very good potential. Emerging countries should also invest in science camps and training centers. Then we had a last panel about the impact of the next generation in promoting space in emerging countries. The session was about how the youth of the emerging countries can capitalize on entrepreneurship to influence space in our countries and find ways to attract investments of bigger companies and local institutions. The next generation has the capability indeed to think outside of the box, but it should have the help of the older generation and their guidance, because it is a way to make it more effective, and that's why education and the sense of international community is needed. To conclude, this is my point of view. We, as the next generation, are the people that will advance the space industry and lead it to new horizons. So let's get inspired by the older generations and follow their path, create new ways to emerge space industry in our countries and work on different aspects of the field. Because I could notice from my classmates and young professionals and students I know that they think that space is only in engineering, sciences, a lot of sort of complicated things or things like that, but it's more than that. It's a policy, it's a business, it's many things. It's a whole world. So please, let's focus on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Iman, for this detailed report and for these inspiring words. And I'll be back to Camille, who will report us on the discussion during the session of this morning on space industry, development and support.
Thank you so much. That I would like to share my panel with space industry development and support. So I have a panel with 10 different nationalities of panelists, which is very interesting, that come from different corners of the world and also different elements of the value chain. I have space agency in my panel, government entity, policymaker, private industry, and public industry, and also consultants. So this is a mix of 10 different backgrounds. At the end, when we have the panel discussion or even the progression, even between industry, they don't really have the same ideas. So it's a very diversified panel that I would like to draw some conclusion on it. First of all, my panel, we had the keynote from Pascal, from DAO, that I won't repeat everything that she said, of course, but 5 keywords that maybe I can draw some highlights your attention is application. She mentioned about application. 2 examples were mentioned. The forest map, efficient power plant management in Morocco as well. So of course we talk about space, but at the end, how space can bring the application and also get people to aware of what space can bring application is very important. And the second one is, she also highlighted that it's a new market for industry development. And the technological innovation is also a key. And 3 other keywords I would like to share is partnership, investment, and business model are also keys for industry development. So after that, we start with our panel introduction, And also, at the same time, it was quite an interactive panel with the participation of the audience that will answer the question. So, well, here I just want to highlight one keyword for each of this thematic question. The first one you can see is we talk about technology transfer. Second one, from Ms. Majaja from SACSA, from South Africa, we talk about policy, regulation to support this industry development. And from China, Mr. Yuan from Kazakh, we talk about what the government means to help develop private industry. So government support here. The fourth one from Jewish Share, Mr. Levin from the US. Well, it is an interesting one because at the end, the answer was very surprising from his side. Here we talk about what are the strengths and also, well, when you look for a foreign partner, what are the key priority that you expect? So the votes at the end are 64% on the technical knowledge transfer and teaching. However, the speaker has not exactly thought that would be the answer, that people will vote for highest votes. And then that is an interesting part because sometimes from a commercial point of view for the industry, we expect that the technology need to work. That will generate application or even commercial revenue for industry point of view. However, in the same panel, we have SSTO as well, and on the podium. Believe that technology transfer is still very important because SSTO have been doing that for the last 30 years. So it is even in the same panel from two industry, private, still do not have the same opinion on the same question. So I believe that we don't have the definite absolute answer here. It always depends on the company, on the industry, how they want to put a priority in developing the industry development in the home country, but also to the emerging space program country. So, and then we have another question here, is more on how we can develop, how an emerging country develop and help the private space sector. So here we talk about more on the contribution to the economy, socio-economic benefits. And then I conclude with a question that I shared with the panelists, but also the audience, is what were the main driver for industry to support and develop a space industry in a country. Of course, it's not the same strategy for developed space program country or for emerging space program countries. So the answer at the end, it is a mix. Of course, there's not a single answer. National space program is very important. We have lots of people from the audience supported as well. Capacity building. So with all these questions that we discussed, I would like to highlight a few points that to conclude the panel. Of course, we don't have much time to go through all the questions, but at the end, the question asked for the audience is also based on capacity building, business model. So very quickly, first of all, one of the conclusions is government support engagement is very important. So national space program and policy. From Ms. Majaria from SACSA, shared that the space program is also help defining the industry framework plan for the country to see how we can promote the development of the industry, but also we promote transparency for the investor. And at the same time, from the government support, of course, funding is very important. Funding from the space infrastructure, at the same time, talk about the CapEx to build it, but also to operate it on the OpEx side. Government support can also be supporting as an end user. After launching it, what are we going to do with the space infrastructure? Of course, we talk about since the very beginning from the keynote, from Pascal's application, and as an end user, and also to contribute to promote the application to the community. Second, cooperation. Of course, cooperation is different level. Cooperation between governments, industry, between countries, or country regions. So we got several different examples. As I have 10 nationalities in my panel, it's a very perfect place that we have these case studies. We get a speaker from ISA, News shared with us that the incubator idea that is working in NISA is, in NISA, we have the program that's even smaller size. A space program country can participate in the ISA program. So that incubator idea is very different from what we imagine. Is more like the someone come from an idea that I believe that the business case of an idea would like to work, and it's the creation of the industry. It's from the way from down up, so it's a quite different idea, and it is support between the space agency but also industry. So, is there another next steps that this incubator idea can bring from ISA to emerging space countries like in South Africa? And another example from the University of Tokyo, from Japan, is they work on a project called Smart Africa Alliance, and with Rwanda. So in that project is in the University of Tokyo, they try to bring the space expertise to a sector which is not space. So, but at the end, for a country like an emerging space program country, in the beginning, you don't have the expertise in industry. So how can we do it? But in Rwanda, they have the IT expertise. The IT expertise, these people, you can teach them to technology transfer, to use the technology. At the end, even they don't have a space program, space industry, but these people have the expertise which is non-space. But this type of technology transfer between the university from another continent into Africa is a quite good example as well. And the cooperation between government, industry level, country, region, international, at the end, is all about cooperation in increasing the awareness of using space technology and social benefits, how to develop downstream industry. And one other example is from China. We work also a lot from Mr. Yun had mentioned that there are constellation. Right now, China is working on 2 constellations that we try to use the LEO, low orbit constellation, to provide communication and also to target tracking for the train network. So it is again, the train network is not a space market. Even in China, it's a leading space program country. But however, it is also one of the important points that we had to highlight. So. My last 2 highlights here is we talk a lot from the question from the audience, but also from the question of the panelists, technology transfer and capacity building. There are 2 concepts of technology transfer. One I mentioned from the ESA incubation is not the technology transfer in terms of knowledge to how to build the satellite, but more from the point of view of transferring the space technology to non-space technology. It could be very useful for those countries who do not yet have the space technology industry. And the second one is more that most people will refer that the space knowledge transfer, like what's mentioned from SSL, that we have in the past, that the satellite export to teach a country how to do some components, AIT, and to do up to build their own satellites. And so there are different ways how as emerging space program country to work on the capacity building, government support, cooperation, technology transfer are also the keys as well. And also from the point of view of capacity building from an emerging space program country, it is also a share opinion from the audience and also from the speaker is we probably need to choose. You cannot work on for small size with limited budget and human resource, you cannot work on every single different layers of the village or industry. You probably need to figure out which sector, which layer of the sector or the sector relation you need to work at the first steps. So my last one is highlight is the investment. Of course, with all that 3 elements that I mentioned, government support, technology transfer, and cooperation, at the end, we come up with investments is all very important to support the industry development. Funding, government funding, it could be a government funding since the beginning of the physical infrastructure, but also could be end user to use the space technology. or a favorable tax policy, or also even from public-private partnership, PPP, or venture capitals. Pascal mentioned that 534 venture capitals that we have in 2018. That's quite a lot, actually. And at the end, of course, we talk about cooperation, international funding, like GMES Africa, or even the Chinese GLEC funding. That could also be a way that we have funding. So this is for my conclusion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kami, for reporting the discussion in this session of this morning. And as usual, the last words in any process goes to lawyers. So I give the floor to David to report on the discussions in the last panel on legal issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Driss. Fortunately, I'm not a lawyer, so I will try my best to represent a policy and law session that I'm sure is fresh in your mind, and I'll try and be very brief. Well, we started off with a wonderful overview of the current situation in space law by Professor Irmgard Marbeau, providing us with the background and the history of COPIUS, and reminding us of the 5 treaties which we all know and love, and some of the principles that really guide the work we do in all of space activities. She also mentioned some of the stresses that are starting to appear with respect to those treaties and principles. She mentioned the liability of launching states, and how the definition of launching states and the various ways that can be considered, and again needs to be thought of as states start to develop their own space policy and their own space laws. Questions of registration, authorization, continuing supervision, etc. And she raised the very interesting issue of the differences between national, regional, and international. And this is really an interesting theme that I think went through the whole panel, because we heard from we were very fortunate to have representatives from Africa, from Europe, from Latin America, and from the Middle Eastern countries. And one of the questions that I think that came up time and time again was, what are the benefits and what are the challenges in dealing with a regional space agency? We know that the African Space Agency is being considered. We were told that there has been some level of talk about a regional space agency for Latin American countries. Of course, we had the example of the European Space Agency, which is a regional space agency. And to me, this was one of the most interesting aspects of the panel, as we move perhaps from national legislation, which is going to be required of necessity, into more regional groupings. I thought that was a very interesting situation that was mentioned by several panelists. We know that it's a time of change in the space activity. We know that there's many new actors. The commercial space is now the dominant space activity, and this is putting pressure on our governance structures. And we really don't have a clear and clean way of moving forward with some of those governance structures. I thought that this was interesting in that these discussions came out in many of the other panels where governance was talked about without any really sort of clear direction, in my opinion, as to how we can move forward. But move forward we have to, because we do need clarity with respect to the legal laws, legal legislation, legal frameworks, that in order to have successful commercial activities. So maybe I'll leave it at that. I'm apologize if I didn't mention everything that was discussed, but I think that I was trying to bring out just some of the major points as we move forward. And again, it is a very dynamic situation right now, and my own personal feeling, although this wasn't, I wouldn't say mentioned necessarily by the panel, is that the policy and legal frameworks are somewhat behind the technical and scientific and innovative work that's being done now in space. And so that's a future. That's the future. We have to try and get those to mesh. So thank you.
Thank you, David. I would like to thank each one of you for your great job during this moderation of the sessions, and also for these reports, detailed reports, and I'll ask you to join me to make a round of applause of all these moderators. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this detailed report on the outcome. Big thanks to all the panelists, and if I may ask you to take your seat and enjoy the closing ceremony now. So that brings us to the last point of this conference, and that's the closing ceremony that should kind of round off the entire conference, and we have a few speakers to provide their closing statements and closing remarks. And first I would like to call on stage here the Vice President, the IEF Vice President for Global Conferences and IEF Incoming President, Professor Pascale Ehrenfreund. Please give her another round of applause to come up here. It's a small traffic jam.
So this is the end spurt, yeah. Dear distinguished delegates and dear ladies and gentlemen, the Global Conference on Space for Emerging Countries has now come to an end. And I think we had a really, really strong panel now, which really iterated what we have discussed and has summarized that. So if you have missed some sessions, I think this was really, really helpful. For me, and I hope also for you, it has been an immense pleasure also to witness this enthusiastic atmosphere of cooperation during the last 3 days. And though we have started, I think, every session 15 minutes later, we still got through everything. And I think the attendance was really, through all the days, really high, though the temperature has risen, I think, to 36 degrees. So I think we can all assert the success of this conference, and we will have to make sure that we continue this set of conferences. We have seen how what a great potential emerging countries have. And I think now more than ever, we have to take our responsibility and support them, and we should not fail in doing that. So I thank each and every one of you who has made this conference a success and memorable. Many thanks to our hosts of the Royal Center for Remote Sensing, CRTS, and the French Space Agency, CNES, and of course to the IPC co-chairs and members for their outstanding work, and also my sincere thanks, of course, to Jean-Yves for his efforts, and also to Dr. Christian Feichtinger and the IAF team for putting such a great effort in the organization of this conference. I'm just now pleased to announce the next global conference, which will focus on space exploration. It will take place next year in St. Petersburg in Russia. And I think some of you, or eventually all of you, have seen the signature on the first day. It will be the third edition of the Global Space Exploration Conference after 2012 and 2017. And we have taken this decision in the Bureau in March this year. And this is also the first event which will be of this kind, which will be organized in Russia. And obviously there is a lot of stake in space exploration in Russia, and holding this global conference on space exploration in this country, I think is really very appropriate. Once again, many thanks to all of you for coming here to Morocco, and also for sharing your views and ideas. I'm grateful that I think this is only the beginning of a long series, and as incoming president, I will also really make sure that this global conferences on space for emerging countries will continue, and I'm also looking forward to the next edition. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and a big thanks to our Vice President who is overseeing the portfolio of global conferences, a very important asset within the portfolio of the International Astronautical Federation. Now, next, I have the pleasure to call up next on stage Dr. Driss El-Hadani, without whom this conference would never have happened, or we wouldn't have even thought about coming here. So a great thanks to him. He is the chair of the local organizing committee. He is the IPC co-chair, and of course he is the director general of the Royal Center for Remote Sensing. Driss, please.
Thank you, Christian. It's a great pleasure for me to say a few words at the end of this important conference. I am very grateful for having had the opportunity to co-organize this event together with IAF and CNES, and this opportunity for me to thank Jean-Yves, who has made the proposal to Morocco to host this conference. This GLEC 2019 conference, whose main theme was about bridging the divide in the emerging countries. I personally observed that you have very excellent presentations and active discussions, so I can conclude that the purpose of the conference has been completely accomplished. In addition, the positive manners and all the keynote speakers, panelists, participants revealed that we have made a grateful preparation and grateful effort to make it a success. I would like to pay my deep respect to all participants for their positive participation and contribution to discussions. I hope that what we have discussed, what we have learned throughout the conference will help us all to, in our duties in the future, and to lead to set up new programs and new projects in our countries and in the region. As was said by Pascal before, this conference is the first step in a fruitful and lasting process, and I am sure that when closing this conference today in Morocco, we are opening a gateway for the future, and I hope that we will continue in this process. Finally, on behalf of all the participants, I would like to express my appreciation to the IF and CRTS teams that have been working hard during months to make this event happen. And thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to address the conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Driss. Now, this GLEC conference was not a conference organized by IEF and CRTS only. We had a very important third partner, and it was the French Space Agency CNES, and specifically Jean-Pascal Lefranc, who was helping us as IPC co-chair and actively participating to put together such an outstanding program. He's the director of Planning, International Relations and Quality of CNES, and please welcome him for his closing remarks.
Thank you, Christian, and once again, good afternoon to everybody. I just would like to, first of all, thank Morocco, Marrakech, and the CRTS, and all the team of CRTS, and Driss El-Hadani in particular, because we knew before that the reputation of Morocco for welcoming the guests was very high, but this time we just witnessed it, and so it makes it very different. Second, thank of course to Val, who has animated all this work of the IPC, and I must say that it was a real pleasure to work together with Driss and all the IPC members in a very positive spirit, and I think that we did all together our best to make a good program and to have this conference as it is. And lastly, of course, I would not like to leave without thanking very much the IAF, Christian Fechtinger, but also the whole team, who is doing a fantastic job once again, and as usual, but still this is really amazing. Thank you.
As you have heard, and as part of the initiative of our IAF president, Dr. Jean-Yves Le Gall, the focus was put on emerging countries, and one very important element was the creation of a portfolio within the Bureau, Vice President for Emerging Countries and Developing Nations. And this is Dr. Valenatan Munsami, who served not only as an IPC co-chair, but as I said, in his function as vice president, had the oversight over all our IF activities in support of emerging countries. And in addition, he's also chairing our working group and now committee as a founding chair of the Committee for Emerging Countries. Well, please come up and give us your closing remarks. Thank you very much for your support.
Okay, thank you, Christian, for those kind words. I can't express my feelings right now. I'm not sure whether I'm relieved or excited. Because I think we've come to the end of a very successful conference on space for emerging countries. And I just want to recognize that when the president of the IAF, Jean-Yves Le Gall, articulated the Global Innovation Agenda, there were 7 key points from the agenda, and the top 2 was around reaching out to the emerging countries and new communities, and the other one was around 3G diversity, which is gender, generation, and geography. And I think we've essentially captured those principles, the first 2 of those 7 principles. But the whole idea on the focus of emerging countries was twofold. Firstly, to ensure that there was an increase in membership of emerging countries to the IAF, and that was to ensure that the experience of the IAF was also rolled out to the emerging countries. But I think more importantly from my perspective was what could the IAF do for the emerging countries? So just leveraging on the network of the IAF, what could we draw on from the experts and from the experience to share that with the emerging countries? And that was the whole idea behind this concept, of this conference. And as Christian has just mentioned, we did establish a working group on developing countries and emerging nations. And under that working group, we started to articulate an implementation plan for addressing the challenges in emerging countries. And just to give you a sense, the focus that we've identified that currently it challenges emerging countries is around the political support or the lack of political support. So obviously addressing the socioeconomic benefits is quite critical. The financial resourcing that emerging countries face, the technology maturity levels, and then also the human capital. And then lastly was the infrastructure, the poor infrastructure, lack of infrastructure, and so on. So you'll note that the structure of the plenary sessions was exactly along those lines to address those key challenges that emerging countries are facing. So in a sense, this is a groundbreaking conference. It's the first conference of its kind in the IAF that focuses on the emerging countries. And the intention is to continue with the conference series in the coming years. And so this was not the first and the last of conference. And so we also want to ensure that it's shifted to other regions in the world, specifically focusing on emerging countries. What I also want to indicate is the outcomes of this particular conference will also feed into the IAC in Washington. So there will be a global networking forum that's dedicated to the outcomes of GLEC 2019. So very much like what you saw at the end of the conference where the moderators came up, we want to ensure that that message gets fed into the broader IAC community as well. And the other thing I just wanted to announce, which was approved by the Bureau about 3 or 4 weeks ago in Paris. There's normally a set of plenaries for the IAC, and usually one of the plenaries is reserved for heads of agencies. And if you attended the previous IACs, they were mainly heads of agencies of the developed nations. And so we put in a proposal to have a similar sort of plenary, looking and listening about the aspirations from the heads of emerging nations. And so that was approved. So come IAC in Washington, there will be a separate plenary where you'll be able to hear from the heads of emerging agencies as well. So, and then looking at the recommendations of this, not only will it feed into the GNF in Washington, but we also want to take it back to the working group. And as Christian has mentioned, it's now elevated to an administrative committee of the IAF. So it's given a bit more teeth than what it used to have under the working group. I'm also very pleasantly surprised when, during the entire 3 days, at the level and the extent of support that we got for this particular conference. Because in the room were heads of agencies, senior executives of corporates, technical experts, and especially the youth sitting in the room. We did try to crack the gender issue, and I think we've succeeded to a large extent, although I think we can do a little bit better in some of the panels. But I think we did come to the party on that one. And then I also want to take the opportunity to thank my co-chairs. There was tireless working behind the scenes in terms of getting this conference and getting the program together. And so I want to thank both Dries and Jean-Pascal for your support on this as well. And also to the IAF Secretariat, because without you this would not have been possible, and to the team at the back. I really appreciate and loved working with the team. It was really a pleasure. And then also my thanks to the SGAC, and good luck going forward in terms of what you've started here. And also to the keynote speakers, the panel members and the moderators. And I just want to make a proposal after the conference, given the outcomes of the conference, is maybe we should look at working on a technical paper that we can publish somewhere, that the message of this conference gets more broadly distributed to the emerging countries. And just my last point, and with the people that work behind the scenes, the fellow IAF VPs, the co-chairs and the secretariat, it's almost like you are an expectant parent, and the child is now born. It's a healthy child. We now have a responsibility to nurture the child to grow up. And I think, and I said this before, it's the start of a conversation that will continue into the future. And especially given the outcomes that came out of this particular conference, we want to build and develop on that. So I'm quite excited on the future prognosis as to where we're taking this. And I just want to thank each and every one of you for your full support during the course of this conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Val, and I can promise you that we will, with your help and the help of your colleagues from the IPC and IPC co-chairs and also the moderators of the panels, will put together a final report, highlights brochure that will reflect the outcomes of this conference, and we will make sure that this is ready by the IAC in Washington. But now, last but not least, I'm more than pleased to welcome on stage the IAF President, Dr. Jean-Yves Le Gall, to give his closing remark and officially close the Global Conference on Space for Emerging Countries, GLEC 2019.
So, distinguished delegates and ladies and gentlemen, I am very pleased to address you this afternoon as President of the IIF and to say a very few words, the last words, to close this three-day conference. In fact, the GLEC 2019, the first conference of its kind, has been a tremendous success. And I am delighted to have seen the attention it attracted and how each of the more than 400 participants, 400, it was completely unexpected and it's a lot. But so each participant gave a close consideration to concrete solutions designed to bridge the space divide in emerging countries. It was a real pleasure to see the collaborative efforts as people were developing ideas, and I am really convinced that from what I have seen during these 3 days, we will see many collaborations arise as a direct consequence of this conference. Of course, none of this would have been possible without the dedication and the strong support of many individuals who share the same enthusiasm and passion for space. Special thanks for our host, the CRTS, and to all our Moroccan colleagues for this their very warm hospitality. I think that we can say that you have made this conference memorable. Many thanks also to the speakers of the different plenaries. We openly shared their expertise, and of course, huge thanks to my friend Pascal Ehrenfreund, IIF Vice President for Communications, Publications, and Global Conferences, and the most important, my successor as IIF President. I want also to thank all the IPC co-chairs, Driss Aladani, Val Monsami, Jean-Pascal Lefranc, should be here. He is probably here. And of course to Christian Fechtinger and its outstanding team at the IIF Secretariat who worked so hard to implement the overall program. Many thanks also to the Space Generation Advisory Council, the SGIC, and IIF partner organization for co-organizing the seminar on the next generation's view on space for emerging countries. I don't want to forget that today's next generation are the space leaders of tomorrow, it's obvious, and that giving them a voice gives them the confidence to face the world's future challenges. And last but not least, my thanks also go to each and every one of you who have contributed to the success of this conference in one way or another. Of course, all good things come to an end, but I am very, very proud to have been part of this wonderful project, and I can affirm that GLEC 2019 here in Marrakech, in Morocco, is probably a highlight of my presidency. I hope that what we have learned through the panels and discussions will help us in our duties towards the new players and encourage their long-term stability and involvement in the space scene. Given its great success, I am convinced that Pascal will perpetuate this conference as he started in inviting us in St. Petersburg next year, and that step by step we will reach our goal of bridging the space divide worldwide. Now that we are at the end of GLEC 2019, I would like to invite you to the next IIF event, which will be, of course, our 70th International Astronomical Congress, and it will take place, as you know, in Washington, D.C. from 21st to 25th of October of this year. And, of course, it will be also the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 mission, which is today probably one of the mankind's greatest achievements, and it will be also the 70th anniversary of the ISC, the one time of the year when all space players since 1951 come together. So I want to wish to all of you a safe trip back home. I hope to see you next October at the ISC. I want to thank you once again very much, because this conference has been more than a conference. It's been a conference for the emerging countries, and it is probably what we can do better for the IIF and for space to prepare the future. And of course, the future is in the emerging countries and in the young generation. So before wrapping up, I propose that we have a short video which will remind us the main highlights of these last 3 days. Once again, thank you very much. Thank you for coming, and for most of you, see you in DC in October. Thank you.
Thank you.